Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to give it a minute or two before we get started. I'll let folks uh, log online after their lunch break. Everyone is staying cool, especially if you're on the east side of the state. All right, well, why don't we get started? My name is Austin Scharf. I'm a senior energy policy specialist here at the Washington State Department of Commerce. And I'm going to be joined today by Aaron Tam, who's leading our presentation, and Glenn Blackman, our director. We really appreciate everyone for joining us for this public workshop on our emissions performance standard. This public workshop comes after a fair amount of meetings with an advisory group that Aaron has been leading, and it precedes our formal rulemaking process, which we will undertake after we go through our public comment deadline here. So I'm going to turn it over to Glenn Blackman to give a longer form introduction of to himself and the work that we're doing under this public workshop. So Glenn, why don't you take it away?
Sure, thank you. My name is Glenn Blackman, and I'm Director of the Energy Policy Office at the Department of Commerce. And I want to thank all of you for participating today in the workshop. And I, along with all of you, look forward to hearing Aaron's presentation. This is a pretty technical area of the work that our office does, where we are establishing an emissions rate using a pretty specific statutory requirement that applies to a certain set of power plants or contracts for power from certain power plants. And then the actual standards are applied in partnership with the Department of Ecology. So our role in this at the Department of Commerce is to establish by rule that baseload power plant emissions rate. And Aaron is going to update you today on the work that has taken place so far to establish the rate, the new rate under that rule. So I will turn it over to Aaron for further discussion.
All right, thanks, Glenn. My name is Aaron. I'm an electric and natural gas data specialist here at the Department of Commerce. Today we'll be discussing the emissions performance standard, which sets the rate for electric generating plants that operate at 60% or greater capacity. On our agenda today, our primary objective is to present the findings of the average available emissions output based on our analysis, which is informed by the Emissions Performance Standard Technical Advisory Group. So on our agenda, we'll review the statute. We'll discuss the Emissions Performance Standard Technical Advisory Group recommendations, the calculator methodology, or the methodology that we use to come to the average available emissions output. We'll compare the results with the Washington fossil fuel generators, and then we'll discuss timeline and adjourn. So first, we'll start off with a review of the statute. We'll review definitions, the survey language, and the greenhouse gas emissions performance standard review language. So to start off with, Here's some key definitions. Combined cycle natural gas thermal electric generation facility means a power plant that employs a combination of one or more gas turbines and sea turbines in which electricity is produced in the steam turbine from otherwise lost waste heat exiting from one or more of the gas turbines. Baseload electric generation means electric generation from a power plant that is designed and intended to provide electricity at an annualized capacity factor of at least 60%. An important note is that there may be a need for new fossil generation resources to provide intermediate load generation or peak power generation to cover periods of high electrical demand. And this new generating capacity is often provided by new simple cycle combustion turbines, frame type combustion turbines, or fast start combined cycle combustion turbines. Simple cycle combustion turbines typically operate at a lower efficiency and thus emit more emissions of greenhouse gas per megawatt hours. These plants are designed and intended to operate at less than baseload rates, and this law does not apply to those types of plants. So that's just an important point of clarification. And under the statute, the Energy Policy Division of the Department of Commerce is required to provide an opportunity for interested parties to comment on the development of a survey of new combined cycle natural gas electric generation turbines commercially available and offered for sale by manufacturers and purchased in the US to determine the average rate of emissions of greenhouse gas for these turbines. The Department of Commerce shall report the results of its survey to the legislature every 5 years, beginning June 30, 2013, and they shall adopt by rule the average available greenhouse gas emissions output every 5 years, beginning in July 2007. So the first part is that we're required to do is conduct a survey of combined cycle combustion turbines that utilities are purchasing and installing within the previous 5 calendar years. And then the second part is a series of calculations required to determine the average available greenhouse gas emissions output value. And in the past, we've referred to this as the emissions performance standard calculator. And the average rate of greenhouse gas is for these turbines serves as the basis for the new baseload electric generation emissions performance standard. So this ensures that utilities are using average or above average efficiency combustion turbines to serve retail load. I wanted to clarify one last thing is that the statute says that no electric company or consumer-owned utility may enter into a long-term financial commitment unless the baseload electric generation supplied under such long-term financial commitment complies with the greenhouse gas emissions performance standard. So folks might have questions about what long-term financial commitment means. And in the statute, it's defined as either a new ownership interest in baseload electric generation or an upgrade to a baseload electric generation facility, or a new or renewed contract for baseload electric generation with a term of 5 or more years for the provision of retail power or wholesale power to end-use customers in this state. So before I move on to feedback received from the Emissions Performance Standard Advisory Group, I'll just pause and see if there are any questions on the statutory definitions or responsibilities. All right, hearing none. We'll move on to the feedback that we received. So the emissions performance technical subgroup comprised of investor-owned utilities, state agencies responsible for enforcing the law, PUD association, and power companies. So you can see the full list here. They advised on data sources for the survey and provided feedback on the assumptions that went into the EPS emissions performance standard calculator. And the feedback we received from them was if we were to use the old methodology, Northwest Power Conservation Council had a lot of data available. They also said that gas turbine world, which we've used in the past, does not reflect real world data. So in the past, we've reached out to manufacturers and used their published data. And then our EPS calculator would basically run those reported data through a set of assumptions to try and mimic real world conditions. And so adjust the kind of the assumed theoretical emissions and run through a set of calculations to come to what's more of a real world emissions estimate for the plants. But the feedback we received was also to use real world operational data with a shakedown period of 1 or 2 years. And a recommendation to look into the Environmental Protection Agency's greenhouse gas data. This uses standardized reporting. They have standards around, using direct stack measurements and actual emissions data. So they recommended actually using more real world data and less kind of this theoretical manufacturer published data and running it through a set of assumptions. And then lastly, they said that some plants may move between being considered a peaker plant and baseload plant. And that's where that definition statute around that intention of being a baseload generation plant is important. There may be some plants that kind of fluctuate in their annualized capacity, but the importance is whether it was designed and intended to serve as a baseload plant. So review the new methodology using Environmental Protection Agency and Energy Information Administration data. So based on the feedback that we received from the group, we developed a new methodology that used real world data. We also chose this because we were unable to obtain accurate and current data using the old emissions performance standard methodology as well. So there were good reasons to shift to the real world data and take this approach. I'll tell you a little bit more about the data sources. So the Energy Information Administration conducts surveys to utilities. And one of the surveys is the 860 form, and it contains generator level data for the surveyed generators, for generators currently operating or out of service or on standby, planned and not yet in operation, and retired and canceled plants. The EPA eGrid data is the Emissions and Generation Resource Integrated Database. It's a comprehensive data source from EPA's Clean Air Power Sector programs on the environmental characteristics of almost all electric power generated in the US. And so what we did is for the EIA 860, we took the 2022 survey and filtered for currently operating natural gas combined cycle turbines that commenced operation between 2019 and 2022. That gives us, that 1 or 2 years of shakedown period. And then we matched that data with 2019 through 2022 eGrid data, and we retrieved the capacity factor and reported greenhouse gas emissions rates. Originally, we only used 2022 eGrid data, but the advisory group advised that 1 year of emissions data was not accurate or representative enough of true emissions rates of the plants. So they advised we took 3 years worth of plant emissions data and calculate an average. And the results here are the list of plants that commenced operation between 2019 through 2022. And you can see here we have the average plant capacity factor in the middle there. And we also have average of CO2 equivalent emissions rate. Now the statute does not tell us to put in CO2 equivalent, so we also calculate separately average of greenhouse gas emissions rate, which is just aggregating the components of greenhouse gas, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and adding them in pounds, and then dividing by megawatt hours to get the rate. And what we end up getting with the 3-year average is The grand total at the very bottom right is 874.48 pounds per megawatt hour. You can see in this graph that there's no direct relationship between a plant's capacity factor and the greenhouse gas emissions rate. It seems to fluctuate for the most part as you go to the right on the capacity factor on the x-axis. You can see the greenhouse gas emissions seems to fluctuate. So there's no clear direct relationship there, and that was just interesting to see. And now we'll compare the results with Washington fossil fuel generators. So we use fuel mix disclosure data and eGrid data for this. The methodology here, we use the calendar year 2022 fuel mix disclosure, and we filtered for fossil fuel electric generation that was used to serve retail customers. And we matched the data with 2022 eGrid data. So we retrieved their capacity factor and reported greenhouse gas emissions rates. Here, this graph shows the plants in Washington State that were used to serve retail load that are fossil fuel based. Each dot represents a fossil fuel electric generation plant used to serve Washington customers and their capacity factors and greenhouse gas emissions rate in 2022. The solid blue line represents the established 2018 average available emissions output of US combined cycle combustion turbines at 925 pounds per megawatt hour. The dotted blue line represents what the new average available emissions output would be using the eGrid and EIA real world data methodology with the most current plants. The orange lines that are running vertically represent thresholds for consideration as baseload electric generation. So the dotted orange line is 55%, which captures plants that are kind of in the intermediate baseload generation range. The statute defines baseload as 60%. That's a solid orange line that's running vertically. And as you can see in the shaded regions, the shaded gray region, the vast majority of fossil fuel generation plants in Washington State would not need to comply with the emissions performance standard, as it only applies to baseload generation. Of the baseload generation electric generation plants that would need to meet the EPS, only a few would be out of compliance. We have TransAlta and Colstrip, which are far out there. We have the Mint Farm Generating Station, which is teetering the threshold of the updated emissions performance standard, as well as the threshold of being classified as intermediate or baseload generation plant. But the Mint Farm Generating Station would be required to meet the EPS because it was designed and intended to serve an annualized capacity factor of at least 60%. And there may be other plants in the shaded gray region that similarly have had a lower capacity factor than expected in 2022, but was designed to be a baseload electric generation plant and would thus need to comply with the EPS. And now we'll talk about the timeline for next steps. Before I move on, I'll just pause and see if folks have questions or comments on the analysis there.
Hi, Aaron. I have a quick question on, I think I missed it, but on that graph, so the capacity factor, it's a 60% capacity factor to be looped in. What is that dotted line?
The orange or the blue?
Orange.
Oh, okay. So the orange. Oh, Glenn just made a comment. If you're speaking, could you please give your name and introduce yourself, what organization you represent?
Sorry. Yep. My name is Scarlett Lewis. I work for PacifiCorp.
Okay, great. So that dotted orange line is 55%. And this was just created to kind of show like a buffer But the statute, as I've mentioned previously, actually applies to plants that were intended and designed to operate as a baseload electric generating plant, and that is 60%, which is a solid orange line. And so the Mint Farm Generating Station is an example of a plant that was designed to actually be greater than 60% capacity factor annually, but is actually below. And so I created this dotted line to kind of just show a buffer to hopefully capture these plants that are kind of maybe on some years they're falling under 60%, but they were designed to operate 60% or more.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, I'll move on to the timeline for next steps. So this just shows the timeline of events. We had our first stakeholder meeting a few months ago, and then we consulted with the advisory group and developed our analysis and calculator and survey. And today in purple, we have the public hearing presenting the methodology and analysis results. And then next month, we'll consider the feedback and file proposed draft rule in CR 102. Then we'll have a public hearing and public comment on that draft rule. And then in September, after considering the comments received, we'll finalize and publish the final rule in September. And then September through October, the rule will enter into force. Commerce will then report the final result of the rulemaking to the legislature. All right, any questions?
Hi, Aaron. Sorry, I have one more question. So I know in one of the previous meetings, there was some talk about the 3 years of data that were used being some COVID years. And I was just wondering, it sounds like you're moving forward with using all 3 years to establish the new baseline, but was just wondering if there was any further discussion on just keeping it to, I think it was 2022 alone, or I know the baseline was a little bit higher with just the 1 year of data.
Yeah, we received that feedback from the technical advisory group to look into 3 years. And I know that you after seeing the results advocated for 1 year. Well, we haven't gotten too much pushback to move back into the 1 year estimate. And right now we're agreeing that maybe 3 years is probably a more accurate representation, 3 years worth of data. But if we'll look at the public comments and see if we get a lot of requests and for moving back to only 1 year of data. But so far we haven't received a big push to look into just 1 year of data and using just 1 year.
Okay, thanks. I was just curious. Thank you.
Alrighty. Well, if you have any more questions, you can reach me at aaron.tam@commerce.wa.gov or email energydata@commerce.wa.gov. And thank you for your time for joining us today. I know we ended quite a bit early, but it sounds like folks don't have too many questions. Feel free to reach out if you have any further questions. Thank you for joining today.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Yep, thank you.